today I get a chance to talk to somebody. I actually should have talked to him last week because I was in Albuquerque and he's in Albuquerque. But unfortunately, our lives were going in two opposite directions at the moment. So instead, we'll do it via Skype. Nevertheless, I'm very excited to talk to him. I've known him peripherally for a long, long time. I've been around his work a long, long time. And now I get to have a great in-depth talk with him, and you get to listen. So thank you so much for being here. And Chris Meyer is his name. Chris, welcome to the show.
Really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I would talk about what you do, except the CV is so long that would take up our whole 45 minutes. So instead, let me ask you to just kind of fill us in really quickly on what your current work looks like.
Currently, I have the great fortune of being able to focus my life on playing with modular synthesizers. It's something I got into as a teen back in the 70s. Took several detours, which I'm sure we'll get to later. But now I get to the point where I get to play with these beasts, but also I'm having a lot of fun teaching people how to use them. Because I'm finding a lot of people today who are trying to use modulars in particular didn't benefit from the ground zero training I had back in the 70s. So it's great fun to share what's going on inside these guys, how to exploit them so you can better realize your musical intention using them. And just I'm on the constant path of discovery myself because there's so many cool new things coming out of the modular world these days.
Yeah, that's so true. The modular is a crazy quilt world right now, but it's also what to me seems like one of the real bleeding edges of the music instrument industry as well. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of teaching modulars, because there's an awful lot of different directions that could take you. I mean, in one hand, a modular is sort of like a toolkit for learning about how sound and electricity works. On the other hand, it's a musical instrument that could use some facility to be able to make music with. And it's also kind of a production device for kind of sound design and sound development. How do you take these three, and there are probably many more spokes to that wheel, how do you take all these things and turn them into a useful way to teach modular?
My main goal is to try to demystify the instrument, because unfortunately I found quite a few users who commonly repeat the phrase, oh, you'll never get the same sound twice with a modular. Oh, using a modular is a completely random experience. And actually, modular synths, for the most part, are rather logical beasts if you know how they work. And a lot of users today never had the benefit of learning how they worked. So I really try to break things down to their fundamentals to start with. I really harp on teaching people harmonics, how harmonics affect the sounds that we hear, how you add or subtract harmonics to change the timbres that we hear. And then I really focus on the fundamental of voltage control, trying to show them the connection between the actions that they're taking and how that's changing a parameter on a particular module that then, in exchange, affects the pitch, the volume, or the harmonic content of the sound. And once I have that fundamental laid out for them, so they realize, there is a basic rule set in this world. It's not just a completely random in, random out experience. I tend to be very detailed in going through modules one at a time, just showing when you do this is what's affecting the output. Let's listen to it. Let's look at the output on a scope, see an idea with what's happening with electricity and the waveforms passed around between these modules, and just try to coordinate your brain, your ear, your hands, and what's happening inside these beasts. And I find that breaking it down to those fundamentals removes that cloak of mystery of there being a little man behind the curtain pulling the levers, and you realize, no, you have control over this beast if you know what's going on. And I find that I get a lot of very positive response for that effect. I demystify things. Now people can go ahead and move onward and logically explore their instrument. I mean, happy accents, fantastic way of working as well, but it can get frustrating when you have a particular musical intent in your head and you just don't know how to realize it. So I'm just trying to show people, here's how to translate your thoughts into those knobs and connectors, then go forward and create your own music.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned this common trope about like you're never going to get that sound again. It used to be in the ancient days of modulars that was kind of true because the stabilization of the circuitry wasn't always there. And so when you fire it up again, the process of coming up and being a different temperature or whatever might produce a little bit of different voltage results. But it does seem that people have this sense like, well, magical cables appear and connect stuff, and If something cool happens, great. And if not, well, tough. And if you pull all those cables out, you'll never get that again. Where if you follow the same logical progression, you can get damn close every single time if you really intuit what it is that you've patched.
Yeah, I'm comfortable enough using a modular now that I can build a considerable amount of a patch without listening to the sound if I don't need to.
Uh-huh.
But I will also, even when I'm building my own patches, typically go things one step at a time. Let's take the oscillator to the output. Okay, do I have the tone I want from the oscillator? Now let's patch that into the filter and listen to that output and build one step at a time. But I also want to make a comment. You touch on the early instruments, which have been romanticized to quite a large degree. And back in the day, we did not really admire those particular traits of the instruments back then. No. The tuning was frustrating. The lack of reliability was frustrating. But I want to point out that even when you have cases like Brian Eno, who famously would put notes all over his VCS3, don't fix this, don't fix that, don't fix this. It's not because he relished the randomness or unpredictability. It's because he figured out what it was doing, and he wanted to be able to do that again.
Right.
And I think that's the thing that tends to get romanticized about it being a great random number generator or I Ching throwing of the sticks. Right. And again, it's fun just to spend a day saying, I'm going to figure out everything this module does, and I'm going to take it places that I don't think it can go, but let's find out. But there is logic underneath the hood here, and actually some of the randomization of poorly designed or poorly maintained equipment just kind of gets in the way sometimes.
Sure. Now, you actually have a fairly long history in doing educational stuff, because prior to taking this on, for a long time, you were involved in writing books and stuff about doing graphics development, right?
Yeah, and even before that, I kind of have gone through this general arc of being in the music industry for a while, then being in the video and film industry for a while, and then coming back to music now. And even in my first pass in the music industry, I did have the good fortune of writing for magazines like Keyboard and Music Technology and other defunct things printed on paper, which people aren't familiar with these days. And a lot of it became because I was an engineer who could communicate. And I found that I wasn't necessarily smarter than anyone around me, but just being able to explain things helped quite a bit. And the same came true when I got into the film and video industry. My wife and I were fortunate to ride a wave there when it became possible to do on desktop computers what previously required 6 and 7 figure dollars pieces of equipment to do. So we were taking a lot of people who did not have this steeped knowledge in how video worked and how graphics worked and trying to educate them. So I ended up doing 13 books with my wife, and we did a total about 50 video courses on doing computer graphics using a particular program called After Effects from Adobe. And that background of explaining things I found has been very, very useful now to carry over into coming back into the music world.
Right. Well, since practically everybody and their second cousin is trying to make YouTube teaching videos, maybe you can help everyone do at least nudge one notch better. What is a thing or two in making a training material that you see consistently people missing out on?
The lack of editing is the first part. You'd be surprised how many edits are in one of my 5-minute videos. It could easily be 100 edits. There's this philosophy my wife and I have about training. We say we'd like to create material for busy, lazy people. And by that we mean someone has an issue, they need an answer now, they don't want to spend 2 hours going through 20 videos trying to get to it, or finding that 1-minute nugget in the middle of a 20-minute video. Get to the point, show them what they need to know, add on to it a little bit, then get out. So a lot of it's just saying, have patience with yourself, do multiple takes if you have to, but edit out all the ums and ahs and dead ends you go down to, and try to keep information concise and logical and linear. Some of the other things I focus on also are things like camera position and focus. All these modules these days, particularly the Eurorack format, have gotten so miniaturized. I make a big issue of, can you actually see the front panel legending of what I'm doing and what knob I'm controlling? And I'll go ahead and put an overlay, like, here's me turning the knob, there's an oscilloscope display and what's happening to the output. So I try not to make the video an ambience, but instead, like, no, this is what I'm doing. Please, I want you to be able to see what I'm up to right now.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned it a couple of times using an oscilloscope. I think that's It's funny because at first blush, a lot of people think of an oscilloscope as being kind of a engineer's tool. But I know for myself, I have an O'Toole right in my rack. Having that scope available ends up being one of the most used modules in my system because it constantly gives me feedback at the position where I patch it. And it's a super powerful way of increasing your knowledge of what you're doing.
Yeah, when I'm learning a new module, it's patched through the scope and through multiple channels if necessary. I have a Mordax data with 4 channels so that I can understand what the module's doing.
Right.
And it's an extremely rare person who can look at a waveform and tell you what that sound is or what that vowel is. But you learn some basic trends on the shapes of waveforms and how they relate to harmonics. And once you've got some of those basics down, you can just see from the change in the oscilloscope display, the sound has got more high frequency content now, or changes like that where you start to make a connection of, now I see what the module's doing, now I understand. Right. And it's not just for educational purposes when I'm teaching others. Every time I get a new module in here to play with, I'm patching it through the oscilloscope and looking at what it does so I understand what's going on inside, so it's not a mystery to me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you mentioned that you have an engineering background, and in fact, some of your history involves being pretty heavily involved in some of the great and revered MI companies as well. What was your role in those days of MI development, musical instrument development?
Funny thing is, I wanted to be a musician or a recording engineer or something fairly early on, but everyone told me that there was no money in it and I'd just be a starving musician. And I found I had an aptitude for engineering, so I honestly got an engineering degree strictly as a mercenary purpose so I could afford music as a hobby. And I was very fortunate that my second job 1 year out of college was being a programmer for Sequential Circuits. They hired me in initially to be their MIDI person. After Dave Smith and crew had gotten MIDI 1.0 passed, Dave wanted to move on to doing other things, so I got hired in from the outside to be their MIDI czar. But then I got to help in the design of several instruments there, including creating a vector synthesis for the Prophet VS. I got to work on the Prophet 2000 sampler and design the Studio 440 sampling drum machine. I worked at digital design for a year. Then I worked at Roland R&D. We had a U.S. R&D office for several years. So I was the chief engineer there. Got to work on hard disk recorders as well as other ideas there.
Yeah, so interesting. I love the fact that you're with some of the stuff you were involved at Sequential. I have to tell you that the 2000 is the sampler, right?
Yes.
And that had an analog filter. I swear, man, I had one of those, and I had this guitar like wah-wah patch that just like hooked up to be able to control the filter on it. And I never had to have anything else. Every track I worked on for ages always started off with that sound because I loved the sound of that filter. And tying a sampler to a great analog filter is something that hadn't been done enough. And it made that just such a gorgeous instrument.
Yeah, the interesting thing is on the outside in the musical instrument industry at the time, there was a bit of a synthesizers versus samplers mentality.
Right.
You know, one is creating sound, one is just recording and playing back sound. But I can tell you inside Sequential, we did not have that prejudice. We just saw samples as another sound source to run through the rest of our synthesizer chain.
Right.
It was a more interesting oscillator. And that's how we treated it inside Sequential. And that's why we always viewed these things as synthesizers that didn't have the rest of the patch in terms of envelopes, filters, amplifiers, etc.
Right.
Sequential never made a so-called Rompler, a ROM or read-only memory playback instrument. It was all about recording your own sounds and creating your own sounds.
Yeah, and then sound designing it from there, yeah. So one of the things I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about their background, and you have this like crazy set of accomplishments, whether it's writing or it's engineering, or it's video production work, or audio production, or now teaching. All of these things are all part of your life and your skill set. Where the hell does this come from? What's your background that gives you such a broad set of skills?
Well, I had the benefit of having an older brother and sister who are very much into music. So, during the 60s when I was growing up, music was always happening in the house. And you hear stories about how some kids discover their older brother's pornography stash. For me, it was discovering my older brother's copies of Popular Electronics magazine. And I'm looking at these things, and I'm just, an adolescent still, and I'm not sure what all the parts are or how they go together, but I know this is really turning me on. And that started an interest in electronics from a very early age. And then I was fortunate that my brother's first roommate in college happened to have a relative who was cutting commercials in New York with one of the very first Moog modulars. And he brought me home a tape one day of some of those early commercials done on the Moog. I thought, my God, I can go ahead and mix music and electronics. I was absolutely hooked as a preteen.
Wow.
So from that point on, I studied keyboard because I saw most synthesizers had keyboards back then, so I figured I had to learn how to play piano. I played bass, but I also took synthesizer lessons on a Steiner Parker synthesis system back in the late 70s. And that just all kind of fueled my interest in doing electronic music. But then I kind of went down the path of being a software engineer. I ended up doing a lot of firmware programming at Sequential Circuits, using assembly language, actually. And as things progressed on a roll, I actually got much more involved in things like intellectual property issues and management issues and things that weren't really involved with designing instruments. I kind of lost interest, actually, in the MI industry. I was very interested in new sounds. I really wanted to create new sounds. And when we hit an era in, say, the early 90s or so, where it became, what does your piano sound like? How many tracks does your sequencer have? And it was not about creating a new sound. I lost interest in the music industry for a while. And fortunately, I got over into the video and film industry, where my wife and I create opening titles for movies, big trade show graphics, things for television. And that was my life in Hollywood for a couple decades, actually. And we were fortunate to be near the American Film Institute. My wife started teaching there. I started teaching the new cutting edge stuff. But I was still teaching things like sound design to new filmmakers and things like that, because I still believed in the importance of the sound element. And I'd even composed a few of the soundtracks for some of the scores, for some of the video things that we did, some commercials and television show openings. But I always knew in my head, Hollywood is not a steady diet I would recommend for anyone to be on. It will drive you crazy. Psychotic people in that industry. And I was sitting at one point back in LA going, there's got to be an end path. When I get out of this, what made me happy? What truly made me happy? And I realized it was mucking with sound. Sitting down with a synthesizer or a copy of a sample editing program like Blank Alchemy software for people who have long memories, and messing with sound. And I committed 10 years ago. I said, when I get out of this industry, I'm going to get back to mucking with sound. I originally intended just to be a hermit. I said, I'm done with writing articles and speaking at trade shows and doing all this stuff. I just want to enjoy this on my own. Until my wife said, how much is this modular synthesizer you're going to cost? And she's the one who also pushed me, like, look, you've already done all these courses for lynda.com. You know how to teach this information. You know how these synthesizers work. Why don't you take a crack at doing a few courses for lynda.com, who was our training provider at the time, and teach people how to use modular synthesizers. And I was pleasantly surprised that it went very well, and there were people who were interested. So now I have this parallel path of I'm getting more and more into performing live with modulars and enjoying it from a musical fulfillment point of view, but I also really enjoy sharing with people how these beasts work. I had a great experience recently when we went up to Denver for the Colorado Modular Synthesis Society. And if you're a pop star, people come up to you and say, oh, my favorite song of yours is such and such, it moved me. I'd have people come up and say, you know what your favorite video is? I really love the one on ratcheting sequences. Oh, that meant so much to me.
That's awesome. Well, it's interesting though that has become sort of like the spot where you've landed, because it seems like in a way it was the long game, and somehow you ended up, the thing that interested you among your earliest memories now interests you again in almost as great an exciting way as it did then.
I try to remind myself every time that I get a little down about, I need to pack and get ready for this trade show, and I need to rehearse this piece for this performance coming up, and I really need to make some more videos on these new modules, and I really should write this article. And I go, if I had told myself as a teenager that this would be my full-time life, later in life, I'd say, sign me up right now.
Yeah, right. I hear that. Yeah.
Yeah. What am I complaining about?
Exactly.
And one thing that has been fortunate is I've been able to use that background as an engineer, as a person who used to help design these things, to explain to others what's going on inside these pieces, because for me, it really is about demystifying them. I feel once that veil of mystery falls, then these things can become your collaborator, and you can get those ideas out of your head. One of my favorite quotes is from the guitarist Robert Fripp, who said, "It's important to become virtuoso and then to just let it go." Some people need to pretend that they're virtuoso every time they play. Some people like to pretend they know nothing about playing.
Right.
So it's have in your back pocket whenever you need it. Yeah, and it's the same thing when I'm trying to come up with a patch. If I have a sound in my head and I'm just not getting it, it's good to go back to like, okay, how do these things work? How do I achieve my goal here? Okay, let's make the technology fall out of the way and I can get back to making music again.
Right. That's kind of a remarkable way to approach it. Now, the one curiosity I have about that is the extent to which it's difficult to be teaching this stuff when the actual tools of the trade are changing so rapidly. I mean, 5 years ago, if you would have made a thing, it would have been a very basic Pittsburgh modular system, or maybe a Deptford system, or some kind of basic system, maybe with an occasional piece from Make Noise. Now there are so many manufacturers, and there's something new every other day. How are you able to build some sort of corpus of educational material that's not going to lose its value 3 weeks from now when nobody wants to use that oscillator anymore?
Yeah, I try to stay away from chasing the hit of the month because that's an easy thing to fall into. Mm-hmm. And frankly, you're right, it is impossible to keep up. When I started researching getting back into modulars, maybe around 2014 or so, it was possible to know every module that existed. And today, I can't even keep up with all the new modules that just came out at Super Booth in Berlin this past May.
Right.
So you have to kind of let go of that. And for me, it's a little bit of going back to fundamentals. For my first course that I created, which was Learning Modular Synthesis, I started with a very basic system of one row of it is what people would typically today call an East Coast patch. Here's a couple of VCOs, a filter, an envelope generator, an LFO, a VCA. And then the second row was more West Coast modules. Okay, let's throw in wave folders, alternate filters, low-pass gates, things like that. Mm-hmm. And then just said, let's go through these a step at a time and not approach it from here's how you use XYZ's model 1, 2, 3, but here's how an oscillator typically works. Here's the features it typically has. Here's how you connect it to a typical filter. Then branch out from there like, we have two different filters here. Let's play with them and see how they sound different from each other. And try to build people up on the fundamentals of look at the waveforms, look at the filter modes, know those fundamentals, and then the rest is wonderful accessories like power windows and heated seats on your car. And in my second course, I purposely started with a very basic instrument that a lot of people have. I have a Moog Mother 32 as the foundation of that course, saying, here's an extremely simple, one VCO, one voice synthesizer. Let's bring in modules one at a time and see how they can expand what this simple thing can do. So I try not to say, here's magic tips with this particular module. Right. Here's not the 5 modules you need to create such and such a sound, but let's drag in this new module, put it through its paces, and see what it's going to add to your musical vocabulary. And I am way behind in creating videos. I have so many modules I want to create videos on, but I'm focusing much more on weighing the techniques as important as what's specific to a module. Now, if a module has something cool, it's good to point out, here's a unique feature of this module. This is what makes this better or different than the other ones like it.
Sure.
But it keeps coming back to, here's what this gives us. What does this mean? How does that change the voltage? Or how does that change the harmonics? Those fundamentals I like to teach. Then let's move forward and see what we can do with that.
Right on. Now, I want to explore this idea of you as, I'm going to kind of explore different parts of you. I want to explore the part of being an engineer. And my first question from the engineering standpoint is, are you ever tempted to just start making your own modules?
I get asked that quite a bit, and I'm taking 2 different tacks to that. One, I have absolutely no desire whatsoever to be a module manufacturer, and hats off to the hundreds of people who have taken that on. It's tough running a company. I worked at Sequential during the dark days when they were going bankrupt. It's not all candy and roses. Right. So hats off to everyone who does that. And I have no need to do that at this point in my life. On the other hand, I have a lot of ideas of how to implement things or things I'd like to see in modules. So I work with a lot of manufacturers, either testing or sharing ideas. And a new challenge I've given to myself this year is I haven't done any programming for 30 years. Well, I bought a copy a month ago of Arduino for Musicians.
Ah.
I'm teaching myself to code again. And my intention is to code up a lot of newer ideas I have in my head that never got implemented. And once I get them to work, just release the code and let others go ahead and play with it or do it as they will. Hopefully, if they implement it as a module, I'll get a chance to play with that module myself, because that's the whole idea. I want these tools to play with. So I'm happy to help them become reality. But yeah, I'm not going to be a manufacturer myself. Happy to help others, but I'm not going to do it.
Yeah. Now, one of the things, though, that you did talk about is because you have this engineering background, you're kind of able to talk to people about, kind of what's going on behind the face panel. The other thing, though, I think that gives you an advantage of is you're able to help people understand why decisions were made. Because sometimes, from an instrumentalist standpoint, we get a module and like 4 of the knobs and 2 of the jacks are just like but simple to understand, right? Mm-hmm. And then it devolves further and further into incomprehensibility until there are some that you can't even tell if it's an input or an output, right? In your case, the background in engineering is going to put you in a position to also describe, okay, the reason that this is here is because there's a natural point where there's an end of this stage of the envelope. So the developer wanted you to be able to trigger another envelope with this or whatever, right? You're able to kind of dive into that, right?
Yeah. 2 things I run into when you talk about module design, because you hear a lot of people complain, why did they do that? Right. How stupid are they to have done that?
Exactly. Yeah.
And the one thing I would point out is like, no one ever sets out to make a bad module or a bad instrument. It's all just driven by either their own dreams and needs of what they thought would be useful and how they create music, and by the realities of here's what parts costs. Here's how much time it makes to design this, and you have to make compromises every now and then. So I try to point out compromises, but also I talk to the engineers a lot when I'm either writing a trade show report on new modules. I'm just taking a break from writing a report right now from a great Australian company by the name of Modular. There's a bunch of filter designs no one's seen, and explaining how those work underneath the surface. But also, I'm trying to get to why did you design it this way? What did this enable for the musician? And then trying to explain that to people. And a lot of it may be decisions you may not agree with. But it's not faceless companies making these modules. It's individuals. It's musicians in all the great variability that we all have. And these are expressions of people's individual ideas and tastes, and also the realities of what they could make at a price point that hopefully you could afford.
Sure, right. Now, you actually, for your modular system, you have kind of a mixed system, right? You have some large format, some Euro rack. You talked in the past about having, I think you said like in your college dorm, you had a Paya modular.
Oh, yeah. My first modular was a Paya modular. Yeah.
Right. So you've experienced a ton of different things. From your standpoint, what is the format that you like best? And what is sort of like the technical reason why you would say that? Or is your interest more artistic than technical?
My personal approach and personal taste is I like variety. I like each module I own to be different than any other module I own. Every module that gets added to one of my cases, well, particularly for my big studio system, I have 3 systems. One is my live performance system, one's my big personal studio system, and one's my video education system. The big personal system, the criteria is you have to do something that no one else in here does. So I'm always looking for different filter designs, different oscillator designs, different wave shaper designs, different envelope generator designs. And for that sheer reason alone, I've gravitated to the Eurorack format, just because it currently has the largest variety.
Right.
I'm not saying it's a superior format. I mean, every time I get a new module, I hold it in my hand and say, you should be in a dollhouse. You're so cute. And I'm going through a thing with my own live case where I'm backing off from 2 HP and 8 HP modules and replacing with 3 HP and 4 and 12 HP modules. Because just in the crush of live performance, I'm finding I need a little bit more breathing room in the layout, even though I'm trying to cram everything into that case I possibly can.
Right.
So I'm not saying Eurorack's a perfect format, and there are certainly great attractions to things such as the 5U format. Synthesizers.com's done a really nice extension of Moog. The Buchla, I'm a big fan of Surge in particular. I still have a cabinet from the 70s custom made by Gentle Electric, a whole bunch of Aries 3080 based VCAs and other strange circuits that's sitting right next to my Eurorack modular. But I just personally gravitated towards Eurorack because I like variety and I want to see different ideas and different ways that might open up different musical ideas.
Sure. Now, I'm going to talk now to you as the musician. Have you, in the course of your musical life, ever spent much time with digital synths, or have you always been, I mean, everything you've talked about has sort of had this modular analog life to it. Was there ever a time where, like, Romplers were your life, or anything like that?
I have no prejudice against digital. For example, the Prophet VS, the oscillator core to that was digital. I love the hybrid of mixing digital and analog. And if I look at my live performance case, I go across the drum modules on the top row. There's an analog drum module, and then a sound modeling drum module, and then a waveguide drum module, and then a granular synthesis drum module, and then there's white noise next to analog low-pass gates. It's the wide variety.
Right.
I did have the unfortunate experience in the early days of software synthesizers of banging my head against their limitations, where certain parameters might cause them to run away or go into harsh clipping feedback. And that kind of has shaped a personal prejudice early on to not spend a lot of time getting into software synthesizers. And I think that's at my own loss, to be honest, because there's a lot of amazing things happening in software synthesis these days. But personally, I really love the tactile approach of grabbing things with a few fingers on each hand and immediately hearing these changes without having to mouse or go into a menu or something like that. So that's my own personal bias. It's not a digital versus analog thing. It's more of a tactile feedback, particularly during a live performance thing.
Sure. Do you ever do any DIY stuff, or do you only work with commercially built modules?
I used to do a lot of DIY. The Pia was a kit.
Oh, yeah, of course.
I built things like the blasted frequency divider. I made a lot of modifications to my modules. I have notebooks. I have big thick binder of Electronotes articles for the ultimate DIY stuff. I just have to admit that I'm so far away, like decades removed from doing any design, that it would be a lot for me to get back into electronic design as well. I am putting a toe back in doing software programming, which also answers the digital thing. I'm going to start programming Arduino-based modules for my system to come up with new functions. But I kind of realize my limitations and realize I probably won't be getting back into hardware design myself these days.
Right. Interesting. One of the things you did recently was this trip up to Colorado. You did a performance with Jim Coker up there. And I happened to be able to tune in on a streamer, which was really fun to see you guys perform. That was a neat opportunity. It was interesting to see a pair of modular players collaborating and coming up with something that sounded much more musical than the typical 2 hammers and 2 trash cans, which is what a lot of modular collabs sound like, right? You were able to do a lot of things with classical sounding instrumentation, right? There was clarity of drums and bass lines and chords and lead lines and stuff like that, but it still was very peculiarly modular in its implementation and sound design as well. I'm curious, in a collaborative form like that, what does the collaboration look like from your seat? What are the things that you consider sort of like your area of expertise, or maybe the area that your modular covers the best, or whatever? What do you handle, and what do you pass off to Jim in that kind of environment?
Yeah, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that, because it's been a fun personal exploration for me to get into this idea of live improvised performance in a group environment, because every one of those boxes are so the opposite of the way I used to make music. There was definitely a period of time when I was the computer jockey sitting in front of a copy of Pro Tools, etc., carefully dialing in every fade curve, every parameters in a completely solo environment. That's how I made music for a while. And then another wonderful name from the earlier days of electronic music, Richard Bugg, who was a person who performed in the original Pia Flexi Disc, for people who remember that,
Uh-huh.
had a live group in LA. He's actually had a live band for quite a long time called Cosmic Debris. And he asked me to join that band. And originally he was asking me just to add vocal elements, actually, because he was adding poets to the group to try to get a vocal element to the musical background. He knew I was into samples. I'm doing what's called vocal drops. And he originally brought me in just to do samples of ambience and vocals. So what I was hearing, though, was a lot of people were just using drum machines and playing one pattern for maybe an entire 5-minute song underneath their sequences and underneath their playing. And that just didn't sound real or natural or human to me. Real drummers add variations to what they're doing. They have different timbres, they add different fills. So I set a challenge for myself of, without actually being a drummer myself, how can I take on the role of a drummer in these live collaborative situations and be more interesting than just a drum machine pattern playing it over and over again? And in the early days, for me, that was sample loops. I built quite a collection of loops of styles and rhythms and sounds from around the world, as well as a lot of found sounds, rhythmic objects like oil rigs doing their circular patterns and figuring out how to blend that into other drum patterns. And I originally was using a sampler, the Studio 440 drum machine, configured so that each loop was basically one sequence. As I got to live, it would just wait till the current loop ended, start on the next loop, and then I would have a change in my pattern. So I could keep programming changes between patterns, but in a live context by listening to the other musicians and saying, oh, it's not like we're going here, the energy needs to go up, the energy needs to come down, so let's change this pattern here, while I also have racks of gear for effects, doing dub-style live effects mixing, and laying in other ambiances and filter banks to process sounds and things like that. That eventually progressed to using Ableton Live to do the same thing, and then I got caught in the video and film industry for a while. So when I came back into modular music, and the opportunity came to start playing with people such as Jim Coker, I said, well, let's go back to that role of being a drummer again. But how would I do that in modular? And how would I make a modular drummer that sounded interesting and who evolved the patterns, but also had sounds that maybe you did not hear, like the typical TR-808 or TR-909 drum sounds so many people like to use for their techno or house performances. So my current live modular case is based heavily on being percussion-oriented, to where it has sample playback, but all these other different individual percussion voices inside, and several different algorithmic pattern generators that I can control and change the flight path of in response to what the other musicians are doing. So on the one hand, my life's a little bit easier than others in that I don't have to worry about notes and chords and modes because I am just the drummer. But I do enjoy being that pulse and helping steer the energy and bringing the energy up and down and trying to find ways of doing that in a live performance. So when you saw Jim and myself play the Freak Boutique, I was basically doing the drums and he was basically doing the melodic parts. Okay. And we were just agreeing on where does the energy change, when did new parts come in and go out, where do we take this next to? And occasionally you'll see in the video where we'll look up at each other and nod, and that's, for us, I was like, okay, let's move on to this next section we discussed for this piece.
Got it. And when you talk about having different algorithmic generating tools and different drum sounds, how are you swapping those out on the fly during performance? Because you say, as you said, this isn't just live performance, it's live improvisational performance. So that means that you have to be really fast on the button to be able to change and either follow or lead as is necessary. How do you set up a rig that's portable enough to actually get it out of your house in Albuquerque, yeah. But still complex and complete enough to be able to be resilient enough to handle that kind of situation?
Yeah, the criteria for this live case, by the way, is that it has to fit into carry-on an airplane.
Ah, okay.
So it is a 4-row by 104 HP Euro rack system that is the same size as a carry-on bag, and I fly around with it sometimes. But I've chosen rhythmic generators that don't just kick out random patterns, but which allow me to enter the density of a pattern or variations, but then come back to the theme I started with by changing a knob or a control voltage. And this was an important thing I learned in an interview with Brian Eno, where he said a lot of the problem with so-called algorithmic music is that it never resolves. And a lot of people who are listening to it get bored with it because it just meanders. It doesn't come back to a theme. It doesn't build release tension.
Right.
So that was an important criteria for me, is to get modules that allow me to do that. And a couple of my mainstays are, I use the mutable instrument grids for a lot of my main patterns. It basically is 25 different patterns that you can crossfade between. But also, most importantly, it allows me to set the density of how many hits are happening per few measures in each of the percussion lines. So I have sliders on the particular version of grids I have here that allow me to increase the density or pull the density back to take the energy level up or pull it back down again. It has the ability to create its own variations, but it always resolves back to the original groove. So that's the mainstay in my case. The other module, which is really important to me, is something called a probability skipper. A lot of people may be familiar with the mutable instrument branches.
Right.
I have a particular one from Laddick called a probability skipper that again says, okay, let's listen to this incoming train of triggers, but I'm only going to let some of them through. And it has a knob and a couple of dip switches I can change of how many of those are going to get through. Are they clumped together or are they spread out in a sparse pattern? Do they hold out when another sound is happening to create a hole for that other sound? And again, I've got a couple switches in the knob where I can say, okay, more density, more density, more density, more density, until like maybe this crush of a 16th or 32nd note hi-hat pattern, but then pull it back down to where it's just very sparse hi-hats, just accenting a pattern rather than being the main motivator in a pattern.
Sure.
So those are my two main tools, for that. And then beyond that, I have a lot of random voltage generators that allow me to add further variations on top of those basic patterns, but that's the core.
And it's interesting to me. So you prefer, like a lot of people in that situation have like banks of LFOs. You prefer working with random number generators instead?
Yes, I do. And I have a few different ones. The main ones I use Mutable Instruments marbles, and I'll explain why here in a second. And also Pamela's new workout, which is the clocking center of my system, has the ability to program some of its outputs to either be things like a sine wave or triangle wave spread out over so many measures, or to be a stepped voltage that may change every beat, or maybe every 4 measures it changes voltage to a new level, something like that. What I like about using the marbles is that it's a little bit like a Turing machine, another popular module, where it will set on a pattern and can repeat that pattern for several measures, but then it will then throw in a dice roll and create a variation on that for the next 4 measures. And by doing that, I've got something where it can set a pattern that's recognizable. It's not just random opening and closing of the filter or random changing of a hi-hat sound, but there's actually a pattern you can lock onto, but then it's going to throw up a variation of that rather than being stuck on that for the entire rest of the song. So I'm much more into those things that can give me controlled randomization. Here, let me get a different pattern. Okay, let's move on to a different pattern. Than something like an LFO that might be, very predictable in its own right.
Right, sure. That makes sense. Well, but it's not as chaotic as just a random source and a sample and hold either. You have it sort of is pattern oriented.
Exactly. I don't have straight sample and holds in my system, except for some tricks I'm doing with ears and rings to go ahead and capture some voltages, but that's a whole nother tech discussion.
Sure.
I don't like complete randomness. I actually like that word you latched onto there was chaos theory. Because when you study chaos theory, it's not randomness. It's a bound system. It says it could be anywhere inside these boundaries, but it's going to be inside these boundaries.
Right.
And for me, a chaotic system is much more fascinating than a purely random system, because I can set those boundaries, I can move the center point of those boundaries, but it's going to give me some variations around that center line.
Man, our time is up already. I can't believe it. But before I told you ahead of time that we would end up with 3 hours of questions and 45 minutes to do them, but there we go. So when you play, do you play solo shows? And if so, then you have to adjunct the drumming with something else. And what do you do in those cases?
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up because I actually played my first solo set ever back in April.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I've been so much into this thing of playing with other people and providing just a particular role of it. It was an interesting challenge of saying, and now I'm responsible for these other sections.
Hmm.
And to that regard, I did used to do some songwriting back in the day. And this gave me an interesting challenge of how do I construct pieces? A lot of it's sample based in terms of words and rhythms and things like that. But how do I create a progression? How do I come with some melodic elements as well? And things that I do are much more world music based and a lot less pop tune or hook oriented. But it was that's become another part of this case now is how do I create a little section of this case to carry melodies and other elements other than just percussion for when I play live. And I was really happy that after my first solo performance, and you mentioned how a lot of modular performances tend to fit into these extended house or techno jams.
Right.
Someone came up to me afterwards and said, "Wow, your piece was almost like a song." And I consider it to be a great compliment, considered how easy it is to get lost with
Right.
modular synths of saying, I'm going to get into a space and play with variations on this one space for 15 or 30 minutes, as opposed to saying, let's have a real evolution and let's have a recognizable beginning, middle, and end.
Right. Well, that sounds like that must have been a lot of fun to experience and a lot of fun to do.
Oh, it's terrifying.
Well, terrifying can be fun too. Come on.
But I want to do more of it.
Yeah,
So there.
I hear you. So before we go, I'd like to let people know how to get a chance to check out your Learning Modular stuff, as well as some of your other work. Where would people go to find your work in action?
Yeah, pretty much if you use the words learning modular in almost any medium, you will find me.
Okay.
I have a public Facebook page, Learning Modular. And if you just go to facebook.com/learning modular, you'll find that, where I'll post videos and different musings and things that I'm experimenting with. I do have a Patreon channel where I get to have really direct communications on a very advanced level with a lot of people, which I very much enjoy. And again, it's patreon.com/learning modular. I have a YouTube channel, which is on my public videos, which again is youtube.com/learning modular. And I have a website, which is learningmodular.com. And that particular site hosts the 4 modular courses that I've done. 2 of them are Eurorack based. One is semi-modulars, Mother 32, and one's actually soft synth, the Arturia Modular V. And it's been interesting to create materials because it was a challenge to me to get back into this world after being gone for so long and knowing that the media landscape had changed from the days of magazines, et cetera. How was I, a long-form journalist, going to fit into this new media world where everything's short form? And what I basically decided to do was to not compete with everyone who's doing fantastic short form stuff on Instagram and YouTube, and instead be the guy who does give you the deep dive, but concise without wasted time on a lot of these modules and get that information out. Particularly, I love Patreon because it gives me a chance to go ahead and write really long articles to people explaining things without saying that's bigger, that's going to fit, and certainly bigger than it's going to fit into a tweet.
Right. Very cool. Well, Chris, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion. It was pretty fantastic to talk with you and just kind of hear your perspectives and your background and all your vision for how all this stuff works. I really appreciate it.
At the end of the day, I really enjoy sharing. I mean, I thought I was going to be the hermit in the studio, but the reality is I just really enjoy these instruments. I really enjoy to discover something and share it with others so they get to play with it as well.
Well, that's really awesome. Well, with that, I am going to let you go have the rest of your day. Thank you so much, and have a good one.
Yeah, you too.
All right. Bye. Many thanks to Chris for having that great chat. It was really great to hear about the work that he's doing and kind of the path that got him there. Really interesting stuff. I won't need to take a second to just pass along condolences to the friends and family of Mark Ballora. He was somebody I got to know through an interview number 195, done about a year and a half ago. An amazing guy, and somebody whose work hopefully will be around to inspire us all. If you haven't listened to it, check out podcast number 195. for more information about him. I want to thank you, the listeners, for continuing to support me and support the podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, drop me a line, ddg@cycling74.com, darwin.gross@gmail.com, or ddg@20objects.com. Any of those will get to me. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time around. Bye.